Hi, everyone, and welcome to the latest episode of the ZapSec Modernization series. My name is Rohan. I'm the founder and CEO of ZapSec. With me is Hitesh Kumar, who's a senior security architect at ZapSec. And today we'll talk about how the security control plane is evolving and the right architecture that enterprises should consider building next. We'll talk about design patterns, transition roadmaps, and a few more takeaways that every security focused architect should be thinking about. Here's something that has been running through my mind, Hitesh, and I want your honest reaction to it. The firewall was a security control plane for the enterprise for 30 plus years. Every access decision, every enforcement boundary, every policy ultimately resolved back to a firewall somewhere in the path. And I think we're in the middle of a transition where that's no longer true. But most enterprises have not designed for what replaces it.
Yeah, I think that's exactly right. And the reason it has not been designed is that the firewall did not fail dramatically. It did not break. It just became insufficient, right? Quietly, gradually. The workforce went hybrid, the applications moved to SaaS and multi-cloud, the data left the perimeter, and the firewall is still sitting there, still doing its job, but its job is now a shrinking percentage of the enforcement decisions that the enterprise needs to make. So the firewall is not disappearing, but I feel like it's being demoted, right? So from control plane to more of an enforcement node. And most organizations have not processed what that means architecturally.
So let me put some numbers around this for people who think in terms of enterprise risk. In a typical large enterprise today, what percentage of access decisions actually go ahead and traverse a firewall?
Right? In the assessments we do, the answer is usually somewhere between 30 and 40%, right? And that number is dropping every quarter though. So when your workforce is hybrid and your applications are SaaS delivered and the users connect directly to the application through a ZTNA or even through their browser, the traffic never touches the perimeter. So the firewall never sees it. So if 60 to 70% of your access decisions are happening outside the firewall's visibility, the firewall can no longer be a central control plane, right? It's enforcing policy on a minority of your traffic. And the majority is governed by what? Like your ZTNA policy, conditional access rules, or even SaaS native controls, or usually some combination. But there's no unified architecture underneath.
And that is exactly where the gap is. The firewall had one virtue that none of the replacements have individually. It was a single enforcement point. Everything went through it. When you fragment enforcement across ZTNA, SASE, cloud native controls, endpoint policy, and identity providers, each one makes a good decision, but in isolation. And nobody's really designed that architecture that makes them make those decisions together. And that is foundationally a control plane problem.
Yeah.
So design it for us. If the firewall is no longer the control plane, what is? What does that post firewall enforcement architecture really look like?
Yeah, so I feel like, in my opinion, it looks like it has four layers, right? And the order could be considered the architecture. The first layer, I would put identity. This is the new outer boundary. Every access decision starts with a verified identity, human or non human, doesn't matter. But it must be continuously authenticated, contextually authorized. And we covered this in the identity control plane episode. So the identity should be your universal policy anchor. Nothing happens without it. And in the next layer, I would put device posture to ask, is this endpoint managed? Is it compliant? Is it patched? Is it running the required agents? And this must be evaluated at every session initiation and continuously throughout the session, not just once at the login, right? But continuously. And if the posture degrades, the access should be adapted accordingly. Then in the next layer, I would probably put application context. And this is where we determine what is being accessed, what's the classification of the data that's being accessed, what is the expected behavior pattern for this user application combo. So this is where conditional access, DLP, and application level governance converge. So the policy understands the application and not just the network path. Then finally, at layer four, I would put in the network enforcement. So this is where the firewall lives now, not as the control plane, but as one enforcement node within the network layer. The firewall still inspects the traffic at the perimeter where perimeter still exists. And your next gen firewall still does the deep packet inspection, the threat prevention, URL filtering for north south traffic. And that is still valuable. But it is one enforcement function within one of the four layers. It's not the primary decision maker anymore for the entire architecture.
So the way to really think about that is that the firewall used to be the answer to the question, should this be allowed? Now the question gets answered essentially by four layers, and the firewall is one contributor in those layers.
Absolutely. Yeah. And the control plane, the thing that coordinates the answer across all four layers is the policy architecture that sits above them. So the identity signal feeds into the device posture evaluation, which feeds into the application context check, which determines what network level enforcement is needed. So each layer informs the next. So this is what makes it a control plane and not just four disconnected tools.
Now, I know what every architect who's watching is thinking. So this sounds great on a diagram, but if I have 7,000 firewall rules, 100 branch offices, and my CIO or CISO is certainly not going to rip and replace the perimeter overnight. So how does that enterprise actually get from A to B? Because nobody rips out the perimeter overnight. It's a phase transition, and it's that phasing that exactly matters. So the way to look at it is essentially through four phases. Phase one is all about the perimeter consolidation. Rationalize the existing firewall estate, reduce rule complexity, consolidate redundant enforcement points, and this really is not a transformation step, it's a preparation step because you can't migrate from something that you don't understand. In phase two, this is where your ZTNA deployment for user to application access comes in. Start routing traffic through identity aware enforcement instead of traditionally what was happening before, that is through the perimeter. So whether you're using Zscaler, a Palo Alto, a Fortinet SASE, doesn't really matter. What matters is that user access decisions are now made by identity and device posture and no longer by network location. In phase three, this is where identity integration comes inside the network enforcement. We have to connect the identity control plane to the network enforcement layer. So the firewall starts receiving identity signals. Policy becomes identity aware and not just IP aware. So the firewall is still there, but is now making smarter decisions because it knows who and not just where. And phase four is what we call policy convergence. Unify the policy model across all those four layers. One architectural intent, which is essentially expressed differently at each enforcement point. And this is really the end game of any good security architecture. And I want to really stress something about this sequence. Each phase delivers value independently. You do not have to complete all four phases to see improvement. Now, phase one, if you really look at it, reduces complexity and cost. Phase two moves the majority of access decisions to identity aware enforcement. Phase three makes your existing firewall investment faster. And phase four is the architectural endgame. But you can pause at any phase and still be meaningfully better than where you started. And this is exactly what makes it a transition roadmap and not just a rip and replace.
Yeah. And in this post firewall enterprise, right? So it's the direction every large organization's already moving, whether they've named it or not. The question is whether you're designing the control plane deliberately or letting it emerge accidentally from disconnected tool purchases, right? So, in summary, the security design today across most enterprises is still very fragmented in spite of investing in SASE, ZTNA, etc. And the reason for this is that most enterprises purchase multiple point products, but they deploy them in a way that they end up operating in silos. So, in essence, there is absolutely no unified policy architecture as a result of this. So, you just created another complex mesh of more and more security products, which really don't talk to each other. And the target of a well architected security design should be what you see on the right. So, this is where the identity becomes your outer boundary, and all four layers work in unison through one policy intent, where multiple signals are actioned in parallel to create the right security policy. Now, you might be thinking, what happens if you have multiple vendors? Now, does this fall apart? The answer is no. At Zapsec, We specialize in cross-platform integrations, right? We bring in purpose-built integration toolkits to do exactly this, to enable the consumption of risk signals from one vendor stack and use those to create desired intent policies in another vendor stack. Thus, even though they speak two different languages, they work as one. And here is a quick preview of the entire ZapSec's unified security service layer. This is a comprehensive stack of blueprints, frameworks, and automation accelerators that help enterprises enforce continuous risk-based adaptive access controls across multi-vendor stack. Now, this enables organizations to have the benefit of investing into a choice of vendor technologies without being restricted into a walled garden. This unified service layer also goes far beyond just systems integration. So additionally, we also have a post firewall architecture workshop that maps your current enforcement model against the four-layer framework we just discussed. It shows you where you are in this transition and what the next phases look like and what it takes to get there. It should be architecture first with no vendor bias.
All right, everyone. Thank you for watching and thank you, Hitesh, for those insights. Don't forget, ZapSec helps companies modernize their infrastructure to maximize ROI and minimize threats. If any of this sounds familiar to you, we'd welcome a conversation into how we can bring this sort of transformation to your organization. Visit zapsec.com or reach out to Hitesh or myself directly. Our email addresses are visible at the beginning of the video.